Hi, this is Ellen Jepson, coming to you from the Pioneer Memorial Museum in Salt Lake City, Utah. We're here for our very first virtual camp meeting. We'll be doing the April camp meeting. I have with me Julie Thompson, the author of the lesson, which is called Pioneer Era Medicine. And I'm standing in the Pioneer Medical Room in the museum on the second floor, so it feels like I'm in the right place. We're going to do this just like a regular camp meeting. And so if you'd like to turn off the feed right now, you can have your prayer and your Pledge of Allegiance and song if you'd like to. I'm going to be giving the history as part of the lesson, or as part of the meeting today. And the pioneer that I chose to give a history about is Sarah Louise Bouton Felt. Sarah Louise was known as Louise, but then she was known as Louie. She was born in Connecticut in 1850, and she came across the plains with her family in 1866 in the William Henry Chipman Company. On the way, she met a really nice-looking young man named Joseph Felt, and as they crossed the plains, they fell in love. When they got to Salt Lake, they were married on December 24th, 1866, when she was only 16 years old. The very next year, she and her new husband were sent to the Big Muddy in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was horrible. They were there for 2 years. They suffered through severe weather, the remoteness of the location, but they did what they could, and at the end of 2 years, they were sent home. They were able to move to Salt Lake, where they established their home. Louie was called to be the general primary president in 1880 when she was only 30 years old, and she served until 1925, a total of 45 years. In 1911, she was on the streets of Salt Lake City and she saw a crippled boy walking along. She was horrified by this, and she and her companion decided that they needed to do something about it as part of the general presidency of the primary. They went to then Prophet Joseph F. Smith and presented him a plan that they wanted to have a hospital. The plan was approved, and within a few months, the primary established a set of beds that were put into the hospital that was already in service. Well, very soon they found that this was not going to be enough room for children who needed help. So they were able to purchase the home that had belonged to the Hyde family on North Temple. And what did they call this new hospital? The Primary Children's Hospital. The church maintained the exterior, but the primary paid for all expenses. How did they do that? How many of you remember giving primary birthday pennies on your birthday? They also had penny parades and all kinds of activities to have the primary children of the whole church donate money to keep this primary hospital going. After this went on for several years, they knew that they needed a new hospital, and by this time, Louie Felt had passed on, but her legacy of the Primary Children's Hospital was not forgotten. A new fund was established by the primary to build a new Primary Children's Hospital. Heber J. Grant was the president of the church, and on his 82nd birthday, some businessmen got together and gave him a copper box filled with 1,000 silver dollars. He immediately took the box and gave it to the primary for their fund for the hospital. The Primary Association took each one of those 1,000 silver dollars and made them into paperweights. And then anyone who donated $100 to the hospital fund got a paperweight. A lot of people remember going to the bishop's office or the state president's office at this time and seeing one of those paperweights on their desk in the church. Enough money was raised thanks to also a brick fund where people paid 10 cents each and pennies by the inch. I'm sure all of us remember giving to pennies by the inch. The Primary Children's Hospital was built on 320 12th Avenue in Salt Lake City in 1952. And it was continued to be supported by the Primary Association of the Church until 1975, That's a long time for the primary of the church to have been responsible for all the expenses of that primary children's hospital. But in 1975, the church donated the primary children's hospital to IHC of Salt Lake City. And in April 23rd, 1990, a brand new primary children's hospital was built. It's on the University of Utah campus and enjoyed by children all over the world, with their expenses still being paid by funds from the church and from all over the world. I hope this is a good introduction to our lesson today by Julie Thompson about Pioneer Era medicine.
Thank you. I would be confident in saying that there are very few members of DUP who do not have a connection, or their family members have a connection to Primary Children's Hospital. I think everyone has some kind of a story or connection there. This lesson was written about 18 months ago, and as a respiratory therapist, healthcare has always been of great interest to me, and this room in the museum fascinates me. And I've always been interested in the technology and the care of people with illnesses. And isn't it ironic that this lesson is our very first virtual lesson, and it's on healthcare, and it's in the middle of a pandemic. Who would have known 18 months ago when we worked on this lesson? Also, as a respiratory therapist at the University of Utah, I was working when Primary Children's was moved to that campus. And as they worked to bring all of the patients to the new hospital via helicopter, ambulance, private vehicles, it was really a monumental experience, and one I'll never forget. Well, as long as man has been on the earth, they have used whatever they could get a hold of to try to treat illness or prevent illness or to ease suffering. And so in this medical room, and at the end of the lesson, we'll pan around and show you some of the photographs, are a lot of pictures of women. It's in our nature to try to heal and to try to ease suffering and make lives better. And I also want to note, Ellen is going to serve as our parliamentarian today too, to help keep me on track, because I don't have a watch in here. So what she'll do is she'll hold up 5 when it's been 5 minutes, and you can do this in your camp meetings. She'll hold up 10 when I've spent 10 minutes. She'll do a 1 and a 5 for 15. She'll do 2 and a 0 for 20. And at 20, that means I need to wrap it up and be done. And this is something that works well in a camp meeting. So Ellen will be our parliamentarian. Well, in the Pioneer era, there were 2 schools of thought on treating illness. You had botanical doctors who used plants. Everything was plant-based, and their theory was everything that we need to heal our bodies, if they're meant to be healed, is already on the earth, and there's no need to develop new technologies. We just need to study what's already here. The other school of thought was Orthodox medicine, and sometimes those doctors were known as poison doctors. And they tried to develop new techniques and create new treatments for illness. And there was a man named Samuel Thompson, and he was very important in developing botanical medicine, and it's called Tomsonian Medicine. And he was always interested in plants and their effect on humans. And one day he was out walking, and he picked up a plant and he chewed it, and he said the response was so immediate and forceful that I always carried that plant with me, and I love to give it to my friends and have them try it, because it immediately induced vomiting. And he just thought that was so entertaining as a youth. But that plant was lobelia, which we grow in our gardens. So I would suggest don't eat that when you're out gardening. But being able to induce vomiting was actually helpful if someone who had ingested poisoning. And there was the thought also that you could vomit the illness out of your body. So a lot of times people were giving something to induce vomiting as a treatment, effective or not. Maybe the horrific vomiting made you forget your other pain that you were suffering. I'm not sure. It doesn't sound very appealing to me. But Tomsonian medicine was was quite popular then. Let's see, the Orthodox doctors was a high risk to go to an Orthodox doctor because there was no regulation of doctors, and no one was required to go to medical school in order to call themselves a doctor. They could just declare, I'm a doctor, and hang out a shingle and start treating people. And if they had a knack for it, they would become a successful doctor, and if they didn't, then they wouldn't. But that was how they became doctors. Most of them were on the East Coast because that's where people were concentrated, but also they were more likely to be able to pay because the economy was better there. Samuel Thompson wrote a book called The New Guide to Health, and it cost $20, which seemed expensive back in that day, except it included with it a license to practice medicine, and poof, you were a doctor. So he was at first not real popular because he wasn't successful, and that was because patients would call in every Orthodox doctor they could, and then when they had exhausted all of those efforts, they would call him to try something botanical, and often the patient would die, and he would say, if you had called me first, maybe, but you called me when it was too late, and now I'm to blame. Now, one problem for the pioneers, there was mistrust, because a lot of these doctors would experiment, and they thought the Mormon pioneers were great to experiment on, and they didn't feel a need to give their best practices, and there were very few judges who would enforce a lawsuit of malpractice against a doctor who had practiced on the Mormons. So Brigham Young taught the people to be distrustful of many of the Orthodox doctors, but he also taught them to use their own common sense and to pray and to use everything that they personally knew, not just plants, not just Orthodox medicine, but anything that they could in the treatment of the ailments, and to not necessarily turn their care over to someone else that might not have the intuition that they did. And so pioneers became very adept at treating within themselves and quickly established people that had great gifts for these things, as evidenced by so many successful midwives and women that went to medical school. One of the first doctors in Utah was Dr. John Milton Bernheisel. And this photo is a picture of his shingle, which is actually in the museum. Now, back in the early days in the Utah Territory, medicine was considered a gift or a service. It was not a vocation, and a doctor was quite arrogant if they expected payment for their services. So a doctor was expected to hold a regular job, farming or something else, and then do medicine on the side, because it would be like someone who is a wonderful cook bringing you a meal to help you feel better and then asking you to pay for that meal. So their services were not necessarily a vocation, and they were expected to have something else. So John Bernheisel was one of the first congressmen from Utah, and he actually delivered the request for Utah to be declared a territory to the President of the United States. I need to look up and see who that was real quick. He was a graduate of a traditional medical school, and he graduated with Thomas Kane, who was a friend to the Mormons. Let's see. He delivered it to Stephen A. Douglas. And then it was there that the U.S. Congress passed the petition, and they were allowed to be a state. So he did quite a bit more in politics than he did in medicine. One thing, if I was giving this lesson at home, or in our camp, I would give out a sheet of paper with the following questions on it. What were your grandmother's remedies? Home remedies have been around as long as we have. And we all remember things that our mothers and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers did and passed on. So I would say, what were your grandmother's remedies? What was the craziest one? What are the ones that you still use today? What are the things that you did with your children that they think are crazy? I remember as a child having a hot mustard pack placed on my chest when I had bronchitis. And in the book, Pioneer Remedies and Recipes, there are quite a few interesting remedies. So rather than go over these, I would just ask you to think about for a minute what you experienced in your youth and what made perfect sense then that might not now. We had at a church activity, someone fainted, and so a woman came running in and just said, "If the face is pale, raise the tail. If the face is red, raise the head." And so I thought about that. I'm a medical person, and I thought, yeah, that's true. And so when you think of the things starve a cold and feed a fever, or vice versa, I'm not sure which one, or don't go outside, you'll catch your death, but different remedies. But one of the most popular ones is mustard, that you should always keep mustard around. Now, I'm going to introduce you to Pretty Meeks, and his name is spelled P-R-I-D-D-Y, Pretty. And so if John Bernheisel was an example of Orthodox medicine, Pretty is a good example of Tomsonian or Botanical medicine. And this is Pretty. And he was born in Kentucky, raised in Kentucky. And his father moved to the edge of the frontier, and because he wanted to build a mill there. But Indians attacked their home and shot and killed his father on the doorstep and shot his brother. And the rest of them survived, and he moved. And eventually, he married, and he and his wife settled on a river in Illinois. And he had a gift for botanical medicine. And people would call him to help. And a lot of them would say, that's better than any doctor did. And he studied. And his wife, though, he couldn't heal his wife, and she had been ill for about 2 years. And his brother-in-law reached him and said, come to visit me. I have something very interesting for you. So Pretty went to visit, and his brother-in-law's name was also Pretty, even though I've never heard that name except in this lesson. Here are two members of an immediate family with the same first name. And this man's name was Pretty Mayhurin. And he had the Tomsonian book, the New Guide to Health. And he went back and told his wife, I need that book. I need to study it. And she said, save your money. Every doctor has tried to heal me, and I can't. I can't see spending that money. That would be a waste of money. And he said, I can't live with myself if I don't try everything. So he bought the book, and voila, with the certificate, he's a doctor. And so he applied all of the techniques in that book, and in his own words said, I soon made a sound woman of her. And she was healed. He and his wife came to Utah in 1848, and he continued on treating people, and along the trail and in Council Bluffs. He had many opportunities to assist people with the cholera outbreaks and all the calamities on the trail. And he had some great things to say. Let's see about that. This is just one of his experiences. He said, we found considerable sickness among the people. Once a widow woman with dyspepsia, which dyspepsia, dys means difficulty, and petsia has something to do with the stomach. So she must have had some kind of stomach issues. Was so bad, she was given up to die by the doctor who had attended her for near a year and said she could not be cured. She sent for me to come to see her, which I did. She told me to try to cure her if possible, to do my best anyway. And if I killed her, it would only be death anyhow, for she knew she could not live long if she did not get help. So I went home to prepare for doctoring her, and Dr. Van Deventer, who had given her out, hearing I was going to undertake her case, came to see me. Mr. Meeks, says he, you had better not undertake that woman's case. That complaint cannot be cured, and you will fail, and you will lose practice by it. The remedy for that complaint is not known. Search had been made for it as far as ships have sailed on the ocean, and human feet have trod the soil, and the remedy is not found yet. I paid the woman 5 visits and made a sound woman of her. And what did I do? Nothing more or less than gave her a thorough course of Tomsonian medicine each time. I knew no way to doctor at that time but to follow the letter of directions. I had nothing but cayenne pepper and ginger for my composition powder and lobelia. And as I went along, I gathered green sumac leaves off the bush, which answered well for canker medicine, and to make a tea to put the medicine in for her to drink. I mention this to show that we can get along without so many kinds of medicine as some would suppose. One of the thoughts with the other doctors was that they were giving small doses of poison to treat things, including arsenic, to help cure people. And so you might look at that and think, oh my goodness, to give a poison to try to heal someone and hope that they live through it, sometimes the treatment is worse than the cure. And yet you could compare that to today. What is chemotherapy? It's chemical. You know, chemo means chemical treatments. And it's a poison. They try to poison the illness out of you and hopefully the side effects don't take you. And so we do similar things today. They're just developed and monitored a little more closely. Well, Pretty's favorite treatment was cayenne pepper. He thought it would fix almost anything. And he had witnessed, due to the cold, many amputations of people, of their fingers, toes, and feet from frostbite. And yet he claimed that giving someone large amounts of cayenne pepper orally would cure their frostbite. And he had many examples of where that was successful, where someone's toes were about to be amputated, and he would give them cayenne pepper to where it would make them quite ill, because it would cause all of their vessels to open, but the blood would rush to the areas that had been without circulation. And he was quite successful with that. He wrote an article for a Salt Lake newspaper instructing people how to use cayenne pepper to treat that. So that was one interesting way. One last person I want to tell you about is Minerva Wade Hickman. As a young girl, she spent her time taking care of her invalid mother, and she learned to be a caregiver. And when she was about 9 years old, her family joined the church, and her mother was carried from her bed to be baptized. And the next morning, she could hear someone singing in the kitchen, and she went down the stairs, and her mother was healthy again. And everyone was amazed. Well, their family traveled to Nauvoo and then were driven out, and they ended up in Council Bluffs. But on the way, her mother, well, first, her brother and her father were called to be in the Mormon Battalion, so it just left she and her mother. After they had left, then her mother passed away, and she was alone. And she tells of having to prepare her mother's body. Everyone was so ill, no one wanted to touch someone who was ill for fear of becoming sick themselves, which isn't that relatable to where we're at right now. People are afraid of catching what is making everyone else ill. Well, that was absolutely the case in Council Bluffs. And so her mother passed away, and Minerva was alone to bury her mother. And she felt so alone, but on her deathbed, her mother said, "Promise me that you will travel to the valley with the saints and don't give up." And so that's exactly what she did. And she and a friend spent most of their time caring for the dead because nobody else would. Well, Minerva was alone. She ended up becoming the plural wife of William Hickman, who was later known as Wild Bill Hickman. Bill had 11 wives eventually and 34 children. And Minerva was a caregiver her whole life. It was natural to her. She had started from a young age, and there was such a great need for it. So Minerva was a midwife. They were living in Taylorsville at the time when Minerva was pregnant with her 6th child, but hadn't announced it yet, because Bernetta, Bill's first wife, was pregnant with her 7th child. And it was such a big deal because it had been 15 years since Bernetta had had a baby. Bernetta was 32 as the age at the birth of her last child, and her youngest child was a daughter named Kitten, and Kitten wanted a baby brother or sister so badly. So when it was 15 years later, and Bernetta announced that she was pregnant in January, everyone was thrilled, and Bernetta took it easy because she was older by now. She was 49 and to be having a baby, and so all of the other wives took care of her. Well, December came and Bernetta had still not given birth. So one day, while Bill was out of town, Minerva took another wife, Sarah. So Minerva was wife 3, Sarah was wife 4, and they went to Bernetta and said, your pregnancy has gone long enough and you're going to have that baby today. And Bernetta was quite shocked and said, what do you mean? And they said, you're going to go to the barn and we're going to deliver this baby. So they took care of their other children, and she told Kitten that they were going out, for the baby to be born, and there was quite a bit of excitement. And when they got to the barn, Bernetta said, what will I do? What will I tell? I never should have done this. What will I tell Bill? And Bernetta had been envious. She knew her husband loved these other women, and there was always someone pregnant, and some of the younger ones just became so frail when they were pregnant they couldn't help around the house. And here was Bernetta, who was sturdy, and she knew at one time she had been young and beautiful just like them, and she was envious because each child was proof that her husband had love for another woman, and she wanted to feel like she was first again. And so this baby would show that. This would show the other wives that she was first and that he loved her first. So when they went to the barn, they said, okay, go have the baby. And Bernetta cried and cried, what will I do? And she said, go over to that hay and have your baby. And so Bernetta went over there, and she lifted up her skirt and her petticoats to reveal rags that had been wrapped around her abdomen to look like a baby. And there, all of the rags were piled, and Minerva said, now we'll bury those rags and we'll go back in the house and we'll tell the family that the baby was not born living, which I guess was true, and that the baby was buried there. And Sarah and Minerva each took one of Bernetta's arms and helped carry her back into the house, and they said, you need to appear very weak, like you've just given birth. And then they told Kitten, take care of your mother for 2 weeks. She needs to stay in bed. She's just been through a really difficult experience. Now, when I found this story, I was hesitant to include it because I thought, how embarrassing for Bernetta to have fabricated this baby. But to me, it told the whole story of what goes on in a home where there are multiple wives. But for me, it illustrated Minerva's love and kindness and compassion, which is just as important as physical healing, is to care for someone emotionally. And that's what she did. She preserved Bernetta's dignity in front of the children and in front of the other wives by following through with that, helping her put an end to this story that she had started and didn't know how to finish. And so it just further impressed me with Minerva Wade Hickman. Eventually all the wives went their separate ways, and Minerva moved to North Ogden, where she was a midwife who delivered hundreds of babies there. So I loved learning about her. Just quickly, the hospitals in Salt Lake. If I were to ask you what was the first hospital in Salt Lake, you would probably say LDS Hospital, which is not true. 2 other religions came up with hospitals before the LDS Hospital. So the very first one was organized and set out by an Episcopalian priest, and that was St. Mark's Hospital, and it was at 5th South and 4th East in Salt Lake. And then it moved about a block when it was not sufficient, and they doubled the size of the hospital from 6 beds to 12. And that was a large hospital at that time. And mostly they treated lead poisoning, appendicitis, and typhoid. But then with more minors coming in and more injuries from that, the Catholic Church opened Holy Cross Hospital. So that was the second one. And then you had LDS Hospital. So there was a great need for that, and all religions were involved in that. I encourage you to read in the book. There are more people and there are more histories that are interesting. That's just a little tidbit. And stay safe out there. This is a scary time for all of us, but pioneer medicine is similar then as it is today. There's still a debate between traditional medicine and botanical medicine. With all the essential oils that are out there and a return to natural medicine, there are still snake oil salesmen out there trying to tell you that their medicines will cure everything from freckles to coronavirus. And they're just, there are con men then, there are con men now, but as women, you are the ones that heal and build people up and lift them, and you'll continue to do that during this hard time. And we applaud you for what you do in your homes and your families, and for the strength that you show right now is similar to the strength that these women showed their families back in the pioneer era. Thank you. Now we're just going to pan around and show you some of the artifacts in this room. That's a statue of Ellis Reynolds Shipp. She was one of the first women doctors. Brigham Young sent her back east to go to medical school. You look at these wonderful women that were nurses and midwives. Instruments that none of us would want near us. But you can see some of the instruments are not that far from instruments that are used today. And now we'll adjourn this meeting until we meet again. Thanks for coming.